House Owner Association. Karen tries to tow a suspicious van, instantly regrets it when the FBI steps out. It started with a notice on his door, a single piece of paper that felt more like a threat than a warning. For David, a black man who had saved for years to finally buy a home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, it was a familiar feeling. The complaint was about a simple, unmarked work van parked on the street. His van. To the Homeowners Association, it was an eyesore, a violation, a problem that needed to be removed. They saw a suspicious vehicle. What they didn't see was the man inside the house who was just trying to build a life for his family. They had no idea who he was, what he did, or why that van was so important. And they were about to learn that some rules are meant to be broken, especially when you push the wrong person too far. How can a place you call home so quickly become the place you feel least safe? The neighborhood was called The Willows, a name that promised tranquility and grace. Manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, and freshly painted fences lined the streets. It was the kind of place people dreamed of, a portrait of American success. For David, it was the culmination of a decade of relentless work, of long nights and early mornings, of sacrifices made quietly and without complaint. He wasn't just buying a house, he was buying a promise of safety for his wife Sarah and a better future for their two young children. He wanted a yard for them to play in, good schools, and neighbors who smiled and waved. He wanted the peace he had earned. From the moment they moved in, however, David felt a subtle, unnerving scrutiny. It wasn't overt, not at first. It was in the lingering glances from neighbors walking their dogs, the way conversations would hush when he walked past the community pool. And then there was Carol, the self-appointed queen of the Willows and the president of its homeowners association. She was a woman in her late 50s with a perfectly styled bob and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had introduced herself on their first day, her smile tight and her questions a little too pointed. She asked about his job, and he gave her the cover story he gave everyone. He was a specialized communications contractor. It was a vague but believable explanation for the nondescript, windowless van he drove. That van was his mobile office, his command center, his entire livelihood. From the outside, it was unremarkable, a plain, dark gray Ford Transit with no logos. But inside, it was a different world. It was meticulously organized with racks of sophisticated electronic equipment, spools of wiring, and a reinforced workstation. It was the tool of his trade, essential for the sensitive work he did. To the residents of the Willows, however, it was an anomaly. In a sea of polished sedans and family-friendly SUVs, David's van stood out. It didn't fit their aesthetic. It looked, to them, commercial. And in the Willows, commercial was a dirty word. The first notice was polite, almost friendly, a simple reminder of the HOA bylaws which prohibited commercial vehicles from being parked on the street overnight. David read it, sighed, and complied. He started parking the van in his driveway, tucked as close to the garage as possible. He hoped that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. A week later, a second notice appeared, this one less friendly. It cited a different rule. Vehicles couldn't obstruct the harmonious visual landscape of the neighborhood. His van, even in his own driveway, was deemed a visual disruption. The letter was signed by Carol. David felt a knot tighten in his stomach. This wasn't about a van anymore. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that he was the one being seen as the disruption. The second notice felt personal. David tried to reason with the HOA. He called the number on the letter, which went straight to Carol's voicemail. He left a calm, polite message explaining that the van was his personal vehicle, necessary for his work, and that he had done his best to park it unobtrusively. He never received a call back. Instead, a third notice arrived, this time delivered by Carol herself. She didn't knock. She wedged it into the frame of his front door with a sharp, deliberate motion, her expression a mixture of triumph and disdain as she walked back to her golf cart. This notice was different. It was a formal warning, printed on jarring red paper, detailing daily fines that would start accruing if the offending vehicle was not removed from the property entirely. The fine was a staggering $100 per day, a sum designed not just to penalize but to cripple. David's frustration began to curdle into a cold, quiet anger. This was no longer about bylaws. It was a targeted campaign of harassment, a systematic effort to make him feel unwelcome. He saw Carol watching from her window when he left for work and when he returned. Other neighbors, who had once offered hesitant smiles, now averted their gazes, their silence a form of complicity. One neighbor, a man who had borrowed his ladder just a week prior, now hurried inside his house when he saw David getting the mail. The Willows, the peaceful sanctuary he had sought, was beginning to feel like a prison with invisible bars. His wife Sarah saw the toll it was taking. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was constantly clenched. She urged him to fight back, to consult a lawyer, but David knew that would only escalate things in a way he couldn't afford. His real job, the one he couldn't talk about, required him to maintain a low profile. He was an undercover FBI agent, part of a long-term federal investigation into a sophisticated financial fraud ring operating right there in the city. The Willows was his cover, the unassuming house and the quiet life, a carefully constructed facade. The van wasn't just a tool, it was a mobile surveillance unit, packed with millions of dollars worth of government equipment. A legal battle with a petty HOA could draw the exact kind of attention that would compromise a multi-year operation and endanger his life. His FBI training screamed at him to remain detached, to view Carol as a minor obstacle. But the father and husband in him felt the sting of every slight. He was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare of his own making. He couldn't move the van, as it needed to be closed for him to access the equipment and monitor the data feeds that were active 24/7. He couldn't explain its true purpose, and he couldn't ignore the fines, which were already piling up into a sum that would raise red flags with any financial audit. Carol, emboldened by his perceived inaction, grew more aggressive. She began taking pictures of his van from different angles, documenting its presence as if it were a crime scene. She would park her golf cart at the end of his driveway, just sitting there, watching, a silent sentinel of suburban tyranny. It was a blatant act of intimidation. One afternoon, as David's children were playing in the front yard, their laughter echoing in the quiet street, Carol approached them. David watched from the window as she knelt down, her smile sickly sweet. She asked his 7-year-old daughter where her daddy kept his big, ugly truck and told them it was making the neighborhood look trashy. David saw his daughter's smile falter, replaced by a look of confusion and hurt. A protective fury, primal and absolute, surged through him. He walked outside, his movements measured, his voice dangerously calm. "Carol," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "stay away from my children." She scoffed, her arrogance unshaken. "If you followed the rules," she retorted, "I wouldn't have to police your family." That was the moment something inside David snapped. The line had been crossed. This was no longer just about him. It was about his family's right to feel safe in their own home, and he would protect that right no matter the cost to his mission. The final straw came on a Tuesday morning. David was in the van, monitoring a sensitive data transfer, the kind of delicate operation that required his full concentration, where a single lost packet could mean a dead end. Through the reinforced side panel, he heard the unmistakable, guttural rumble of a heavy-duty engine, followed by the high-pitched beep, beep, beep of a vehicle in reverse. He peered through a pinhole camera disguised as a rivet on the van's exterior. A massive tow truck was backing up to his driveway, its yellow emergency lights flashing impatiently, casting a sickly, strobing glow across the manicured lawns of the Willows. And, standing on the sidewalk, phone held high to record her victory, was Carol. A triumphant, venomous smirk was plastered across her face. She had done it. She had called in the final solution. A surge of ice-cold adrenaline shot through David's veins, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his early days in the field. This was it, the point of no return. Years of training, the entire federal investigation, the safety of his family. It was all about to be literally towed away and potentially cracked open because of this woman's petty, obsessive crusade. He couldn't let them hook up the van. The equipment inside was not only classified but also extremely sensitive. A rough tow could damage it, setting the investigation back months, if not years. He had no choice. His cover, so meticulously crafted, was about to be blown in the most spectacular and public way imaginable. He couldn't let them hook up the van. The equipment inside was not only classified but also extremely sensitive. A rough tow could damage it, setting the investigation back months, if not years. He had no choice. His cover, so meticulously crafted, was about to be blown in the most spectacular and public way imaginable. He couldn't let them hook up the van. The equipment inside was not only classified but also extremely sensitive. A rough tow could damage it, setting the investigation back months, if not years. He had no choice. His cover, so meticulously crafted, was about to be blown in the most spectacular and public way imaginable. He swung the van door open and stepped out, his face a mask of calm fury. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice low and steady, each word deliberately aimed at the tow truck driver. The driver, a burly man in greasy overalls, just shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Got a call. Car's in violation. I'm just doing my job, pal." Carol strutted forward, her phone still recording, capturing every second of her perceived triumph. "He's not your pal," she chirped, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "He's a rule breaker who thinks he's above this community. We have regulations, and this is the consequence." David ignored her completely, his focus locked on the driver. "You cannot touch this vehicle. It is the property of the United States government." Carol let out a shrill, piercing laugh. "Government property? Oh, that's the best one I've heard all year. What are you, a mailman with a secret? This junker is an eyesore, and it's leaving today." She waved the stack of her red paper notices at the driver like a weapon. "Here's all the proof you need. Now hook it up." The driver hesitated, his gaze flickering between David's intense, unblinking stare and Carol's smug, demanding face. David knew he had only seconds. He pulled out his own phone, but he didn't press record. He made a call. He spoke only a few words, his voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the unfolding chaos. "It's compromised. I need immediate support. My location." What happened next felt like something out of a movie. Before the tow truck driver could even lower his chains, the sound of sirens, faint at first, grew into a deafening, multi-layered roar. But these weren't local police. Two black SUVs, identical and menacing, screamed around the corner and screeched to a halt with military precision, boxing in the tow truck. A third followed, parking sideways across the street, blocking all traffic. Doors flew open, and 6 agents in full tactical gear, armed with rifles, emerged and took up strategic positions with a fluid, terrifying efficiency. The suburban quiet of the Willows was shattered. Neighbors who had been peeking from behind their curtains now stood frozen on their porches, their mouths agape, their morning coffee forgotten. Carol's smug expression melted. It slid from her face like wax, replaced by a mask of confusion, then disbelief, and finally sheer, unadulterated terror. Her phone slipped from her trembling hand and clattered onto the pavement, the screen cracking. The tow truck driver had his hands up, his face pale with shock, realizing he was caught in something far beyond an HOA dispute. The passenger door of the lead SUV opened, and a man in a sharp, dark suit stepped out. This was Agent Miller, David's direct superior. He walked past the armed agents with an air of absolute authority and stopped directly in front of a trembling Carol. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a razor, "my name is Special Agent Miller, Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are currently and very seriously obstructing a federal investigation. That vehicle you've been trying to tow for the past month is a United States government surveillance unit. "And you," he said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her physically recoil, "are in a great deal of trouble." The silence that followed Agent Miller's words was heavier than any sound. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and arrogance out of the pristine suburban morning. Carol stood frozen, her face a ghastly shade of pale. The world she had so carefully controlled, a world of manicured lawns and iron-fisted rules, had just collided with a world of federal authority and consequences she couldn't possibly comprehend. She tried to speak, to form a defense, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. Her power, which had seemed so absolute just moments before, had vanished completely. Agent Miller didn't wait for an answer. He simply nodded to one of his agents, who stepped forward and began to quietly, professionally question her, reading her rights for interfering with a federal operation. The tow truck driver was similarly escorted away for questioning, his face a mask of pure relief at being removed from the situation. For David, it was a strange, hollow victory. His cover in the neighborhood was irrevocably blown. Within hours, the FBI had discreetly but completely relocated his family to a secure location. The investigation he had been working on was salvaged thanks to the data he had been monitoring, but his role in it was over. He had become a known face. As they packed their essential belongings, Sarah held his hand, her eyes filled not with fear, but with a fierce pride. The peace of the Willows had been a fragile illusion, and they both knew it. The real peace came from knowing he had protected his family, that he had refused to be broken by the quiet tyranny of prejudice disguised as rules. Carol and the HOA faced severe repercussions. Obstructing a federal investigation was no small matter. She was charged, and the ensuing legal battle drained her finances and shattered her reputation. The HOA itself was hit with a federal lawsuit that left it bankrupt and discredited. The story became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered among other neighborhood associations. Be careful who you push, because you never know who they really are. The house in the Willows was sold. The harmonious visual landscape was restored, but the neighborhood was forever changed. The silence on the street was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with the memory of the day the real world came crashing into their suburban bubble. In the end, this was never just a story about an HOA and a van. It was about what that van represented. To Carol, it was a symbol of something that didn't belong, an unwelcome intrusion into her perfect world. She didn't see a family man trying to make a living. She saw a threat to her order. And she used the rules not to protect the community, but to target someone she had already judged. David and his family found a new home, one where the neighbors smiled genuine smiles, and the worth of a person wasn't measured by the vehicle they drove. But the experience left its mark. It was a stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous threats aren't from the criminals you chase, but from the ordinary people who let fear and prejudice turn them into monsters. How many rules in our own lives are just excuses to exclude others? And how often do we stand by in silence while it happens?